Hello, Brian Pierce with the Pierce Brothers. Today we're going to talk about the Registered Magnum, the Smith & Wesson Registered Magnum, or Registered 357 Magnum. Very significant gun in history, very highly sought after with collectors. But before we get to that, let's go back and talk about what guns led up to the development of that. Of course, the famous Smith & Wesson triple lock, or what's commonly known as the first model hand ejector, the New Century revolver, was of course the very first end frame. There's a couple of examples. There's a nickel with a 5-inch barrel, ivory stocks. Here's a 4-inch, very, very rare. The unique thing about these guns was that they here's a triple lock target, which is even scarcer, but they locked in the crane at the end of the ejector rod and at the back end of the cylinder. And these guns were famous for not being heat treated, the cylinders. And that was one of the reasons that Smith & Wesson dragged their feet on ever coming out with heavy loads in that particular caliber. So this led into what was known as the second model hand ejector. The wartime and during wartime, and especially in Britain and so on, they instantly complained that the shrouded barrel was holding dirt and mud, that the triple locks were not working in the trenches. So they came out with like the model 1917, which was a great gun as well, but it didn't have the locking device in the crane. It only locked at the end of the ejector and at the back of the cylinder. So here's a second model hand ejector as well, 44 Special, and they were great guns. They dropped the price a little bit on them. Kind of a piece of history on that part too. But those were the first models that actually had the heat-treated cylinders. Now this is where it gets more interesting. This led into what was known as the 3844 heavy duty and 3844 outdoorsman. The heavy duty being fixed sights, the outdoorsman being adjustable sighted. Standard barrel length on it was 6.5, although it was special ordered in other lengths. And this absolutely, I know a lot of people say that triple lock was the nicest finished. Elmer Keith was notorious for saying this, that it was the finest revolver Smith & Wesson ever produced. I don't disagree. They were beautifully made, very well made, but I think that the 3844 outdoorsmans were nicer, my opinion. I've got several of each, many of each actually. These are just beautifully finished guns. They were of course a 38 Special built on the 44 frame. Part of the reason this gun was developed was during the gangster years, they found that the standard 38 Specials were failing to penetrate car bodies and so on. The police wanted more power, and so they came out with special high velocity, or 3844, meaning the 44 frame, 38 caliber on the 44 frame is what that stood for. And they could of course load it up. They had metal piercing bullet loads as well and so on. But then there was the experimenters, particularly like Elmer Keith and Phil Sharp and some of those that began pushing this to higher velocities and higher levels. And Doug Wesson, who of course was kind of the ramrod at Smith & Wesson, and family name if you will, and he began running with the idea of creating a special high performance 3844, and this led to a lot of experimenting by Phil Sharp, but Elmer Keith was also involved in that. In fact, Elmer Keith loaded up a large quantity of his bullet, the Lyman 358 429 bullet, a cast bullet he designed, and he ran it with 11 grains of DuPont number 80 powder. And I've actually tested that load. You probably don't know a lot of people have done that, but I have. And Keith said it was running 42,000 pounds pressure. He wasn't far off by modern piezoelectric measurement methods. So we'll just say that. He shot it, said that the gun handled it no problems. I believe him 100%. Here's a couple of more. That particular one had the humpback hammer. This one has the Magnus stocks. These, of course, 1930s era's gun. These were the basis to develop the 357. There was a lot of more experimenting at the factory and so forth. One thing that this gun had was that it was just simply a round barrel, polished top strap on it, And these were really, really great guns. So this led to the development of some further experimenting. Smith & Wesson worked with Winchester to actually make the case. The early cases actually contain, and it's been printed many times, it was Remington. That's actually not true. It was a Winchester development. But the original case had a large pistol primer, not a small pistol primer. And Elmer Keith casted up a bunch of bullets and sent them off to Doug Wesson. He did some experimenting ultimately, and he sent some to Winchester too, but ultimately they modified the Keith design and they came up with a 158 grain semi-wad cutter lead bullet. The original load contained 15.3 to 15.4 grains of Hercules 2400 powder. Now that powder is Alliant. Very hard to find, by the way, but at this moment. But it was a very hot load. Out of the 8 3/4 inch, not 8 3/8 inch, 8 3/4 inch barrels, Smith & Wesson claimed over 1,500 feet per second velocity with it. I don't doubt it. It was a hot load. Now, before you load that load in a modern gun or at all, SAMI, the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute that regulates ammo and so forth, by that standard, that the 357 at that time originally was introduced was running about 43,000 copper units of pressure. Today, it's been reduced. Well, I shouldn't say reduced. It's been changed to 35,000 psi. The two numbers really don't coincide with each other. They're not interchangeable. With that said, 35,000 psi is slightly reduced from the original pressure. So that load today would be, there's two problems with it. One, it'd be a little bit on the warm side. Second thing is, I'd have to go back to my notes, but it's literally been 40 years ago or close to it that Hercules changed the original formula for 2400. They actually made it a little faster burning. So you're gonna have to reduce that load anyway, but most generally with most 158s, you're gonna hit a max load of around 14.5 to 14.8 grains of 2400 powder. You're going to want to use a standard primer with that and not a Magnum. But I'm off subject. So when the 357 finally hit, it was a sensation. It was like, nobody had ever pushed a revolver that fast before in a factory, in a production gun. It was beautifully made. Everything about this gun was custom. It was, now get this, it sold for a whopping $60 in the middle of the Great Depression. Smith & Wesson really honestly believed that only a few guns would be sold. And with each gun in the box came a registration certificate that the owner could turn and mail it back to the factory and get actually I said certificate, I meant card. The owner could turn and send it back to the factory and they'd get a registration certificate outlining the details of the gun, how it was sighted in, every feature that was on it. And those are very sought after today, either the card or the registration certificate. But the guns were truly deluxe. In fact, this doesn't sound like a big deal today, but all the chambers were countersunk. Honestly, it wasn't needed, but it was to show that they were sparing no expense to make this a truly deluxe revolver. The top strap of the frame and the rib on the barrel were all knurled, hand knurled. Inside the yoke and the frame was a registration number, so it'd say REG and then a number. And today when we hear a registered gun, us pro gunners are like, no, registered, what do you mean? But at that time there was no gun registration. You could order direct, you could order guns mail, however you wanted. There was no regulation. So registered just meant registered to the owner. So the interesting thing was that the barrel lengths could be ordered in any length in 1/4 inch increments from 3.5 to 8 3/4 inches. And so collectors today just go nuts because there's all sorts of special lengths, special options that could be ordered. You could order different style front sights. This one happens to have a bead on it, called gold bead as they called it. This one was a reflector style sight. This is a 6.5 inch, by the way, and this one here is actually a 8 3/8 inch barrel. Here's a pair of 5.5 inch. One has a Patridge style front with a called gold bead, and this one has a bead front sight. interesting. Both 5-inch guns. I call them a pair, but they're both great shooters. This one actually went to the Kansas City Police Department, a 4-inch gun, pretty rare. The 4-inch is very rare, in fact. So a few other features that they had. Of course, the rear sight was not the micro adjustable that we've grown so accustomed to with post-war Smith & Wessons. It is a kind of a, I don't want to say drift. It's not a drift adjustable, but it's got 2 opposing screws. You loosen one, you turn the other one, and it just moves over and locks it in place. So the couple other things, these were on the long action. So in the post-war years, they eventually developed a short action version of this gun, or of all guns, basically all the end frames. There was some transition period, but these were long action. Man, they were smooth. They were buttery smooth. They didn't stack up. So when you pull the trigger, it just feels like it's the same weight all the way through. It almost feels like it gets lighter as it comes back. Speed shooters that shoot double action, Elmer Keith, Ed McGivern, Jerry Mikulik in modern times, they all have all gravitated toward the Smith & Wesson action. It is the ideal double action revolver. So a couple other things that this gun had. The sides of the hammer were all serrated, if you will, that were to relieve stress and contact on that hammer. The triggers were just fabulous right out of the box, just buttery smooth, broke like glass, crisp and clean. They had, think what else about them? There was a number of experimental things performed to the Registered Magnums, actually, and they were. Before I get too far on that, I won't go back to the ammo. The original, this is a very original box of the ammunition that Winchester loaded, just a lead bullet, and they eventually came to a Lubaloy lead bullet. These are all pre-war ammunition, by the way, and a metal piercing load for police officers, which was an interesting load. Penetrate car bodies and so forth better. Now, to better show the potential of this gun, Doug Wesson, he was an Eastern dude in his own words as he described himself. He was very well liked by people that knew him. He was a real gentleman. He was very well respected by his peers, which that's always an indicator of someone's character. So he took a pair of them, and I don't remember the registration number on those two. It's on the tip of my tongue. I want to say 0373. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he took a pair of those and he went west. Went throughout the late 30s, multiple trips. He went to Alaska. He shot grizzly bear, shot elk, antelope, mule deer. I believe there might have been a black bear involved in that. I think. Anyway, there was other game as well. But in Elmer Keith's words, he said some of those were distances that were long rifle shots. And Doug was a good shot, obviously, and he proved the interest in handgun hunting. He actually helped promote that. He was instrumental in a book called Burning Powder that was a series of books that Smith & Wesson published, little booklets, I should say, not books, but booklets. And so, as an interesting note as well, Elmer Keith was one of the early ones that wrote the 357 Magnum up. He went up the Passamaquoddy Valley in Idaho, which is about an hour drive from Salmon, shot jackrabbits for several days at extreme distances. He'd wait till they hop out in the evening. He'd sit and shoot them and shoot them and shoot them. And he tested factory loads, his hand loads, a variety of stuff, and he proved wherein his hand loads would outshoot the factory loads. And but he was very fond of the gun. But this is where it kind of gets humorous. So, and his was 0362, which indicated it was a prototype with the 0. But here's where it gets interesting. So I got this picture from Elmer's gunsmith named Don Mahalovic, who lived about 8 or 9 miles out of Salmon. And many of the photos that you see in Elmer Keith's book, Hell, I Was There, and Guns and Ammo and other things were taken at Don's place, because Elmer, after he moved out of North Fork and he went down from North Fork, Idaho into Salmon, he was, of course, living in town. He lived literally right just down the street from the courthouse, across from the Methodist church, and he he didn't have a place to shoot anymore like he did out on North Fork. And North Fork was quite a drive for him. He still retained that property, and actually his son Ted actually inherited that, but that's a whole nother story. So Elmer, as much as he supported that development of the 357 and worked with Doug Wesson on that, in the same breath he kept saying, wait, what about a 44 Magnum or a 44 Special modernized? You know, he wanted heavy loads in it and so on. And so I got this from Don Mihalovic, Elmer's gunsmith, many years ago, and it came out of Elmer Keith's collection. It's really kind of funny. It was painted, I think, in 1977, and it was named Winter Graphics. It has a picture of Smith & Wesson 357, and it has a picture here. We'll maybe try to sneak in a photo of this, of course, Ed McGivern, and it has Elmer Keith over here holding up a 44 with a hollow point with a question mark saying 44. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting piece of history I thought you might enjoy in relation to the 357 Registered Magnum. So now they only produced about 5,200 and 2,500 or 5,225 guns, I think, is what they produced. 5,225, right around that, in the Registered Magnum. Now, the order eventually came in 1939, so it was introduced in 1935. The order actually eventually came in 1939 to drop the registration number, and that is again where it was stamped inside the crane on the against the frame. And they were trying to save expense in manufacture. They didn't want to mess with the certificates anymore. U.S. was getting ready to go into World War II. Smith & Wesson was trying to focus their efforts towards building wartime production, you know, goods and guns and so forth and so forth. So the registration number was dropped. At that point, the gun continued to be manufactured, but it was just known as the Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum. And then, of course, the war broke out shortly thereafter. And so those guns that do not have the registered number on the frame are actually more rare than the registered mag, but the collectors still want the registered mag, so they still bring more, even though the plain pre-war without the registration is more rare. So these guns have proven very, very accurate. I've shot these for many years. I've owned many of them for many years actually, and shot them a lot. I only use cast lead bullets in them due to barrel wear. And we've done a separate video on that earlier. You can probably go on YouTube and check out our statements on that. But basically, the cast bullets will allow that barrel to shoot for many years without wear, whereas jacketed bullets will cause very rapid forcing chrome erosion on that barrel. Particularly during these era, the steels in these barrels were not as hard as we have today, and these are vintage guns. They're as most collectors know, in rough numbers, they're $10,000 a pop, and sometimes more, depending on significance. Or if you get a lower condition gun, you'll pay less on that, obviously. But you know, in rough numbers, they're $10,000 guns each. So you really want to take care of them. So a couple of things. I made a couple of notes very quickly that you might find interesting. Phil Sharp got, well, actually, let me go back. J. Edgar Hoover got registration gun number 1, which I believe was a 3.5-inch barrel. Phil Sharp got registration gun number 2. Ed McGivern got gun number 8. Jimmy Stewart, the actor, yeah, he got gun number 100. And General George Patton, he got gun number 506. His was a 3.5-inch Magnum he carried throughout World War II. Had ivory grips on it and so forth. Carried a Colt single action on one side, the Smith & Wesson on the other. He called that his killing gun, by the way. So, yeah, there was 5,224 guns manufactured with the registration number. So, now, another thing I mentioned, the accuracy of these guns. To support that, of course, Elmer Keith talked about a lot of the accuracy he's gotten in various writings he did in 6 guns and other things. But the FBI adopted that gun almost immediately. Now, what's interesting is that at that time, and this is really not a bad idea, in fact, it'd been around for a long time with the cavalry and so forth, and they using the old Colt single action Army 45, the soldiers were trained to lay their horses down and shoot at targets at 400 and 500 yards if they were caught out where that's what they had was a single action revolver. So the FBI took that same mindset and they're like, well, if we have an agent that gets pinned down by a rifleman or whatever, can he effectively return fire with this gun? So they tested things at long range, as well as Ed McGivern in his book Fast and Fancy Revolver Shooting. Now, Dick Tinker was the one that actually did the shooting in this, but Dick Tinker was the one that he was trained by Elmer Keith. Elmer was originally slated to do it for Ed McGivern in his book. For a couple reasons, that didn't work out. I don't know if it was the distance. We take distance today, from Idaho to Montana or whatever. We don't think much about it. Jump a plane or jump in a comfortable car or truck and away you go. But in those days, it was a job to travel. So Dick Tinker did the shooting, but Dick had been trained by Elmer Keith. But at 600 yards, they used a man silhouette, just the upper torso, and they got more than 50% hits on 150 shots. So those that question long-range shooting, there it is. They got more than 75 hits at 600 yards with 9er sighted Smith & Wesson 357 registered Magnum. Pretty impressive shooting. Now, with that said, with better ammunition, more tuning, I can tell you they will shoot better now. I can tell you that absolutely without a question. So it's not Brian Pierce stating it. Smith & Wesson, Doug Wesson did similar testing and very impressive results, and yet today we can even do better. So there you have it. There's the 357 registered Magnum. Now, just a couple of comments. In the post-war years, they came out with what was known as the short action. So if you compare the two, you'll see that the long action, the hammer travels further. The long actions were wonderfully smooth. There was, of course, some advantages with the short action. Here's a 3.5-inch model. Well, it's actually a pre-model 27, but it's a post-war gun. It's made a nickel gun that actually belonged to a sheriff, also a 5-screw gun. Here's another example, a 6-inch beautifully made guns. Now, this is going to lead into a video we'll do before very long, and I have to smile when I say this because I'm going to make some people really mad at me by saying this. So there's been a real trend the last number of years about Colt snake guns, as they call them. And here's a Python. This is a very early Python, been in my collection for a long, long time, more decades than I care to admit. It's digested a lot of ammo. I've actually got a number of Pythons. And this gun was introduced, of course, in 1955. It was a very nice gun, very stylish. Had, just very well laid out in the vented rib. Of course, the barrel was had a special crown on it. They were high polished, and of course the actions were very smooth. They were stylish in how they shaped the grips and so forth, the stocks as they're technically called. And of course, Python 357, very cool name. So they were very well received. They sold for $125, $150 in the early post-war era, right in that range. Of course, they had adjustable rear sights and so forth. Great gun, really is. But this is where I'm going to get some hate mail on this, I know. So today, people claim, well, the Python is the finest 357 double-action revolver ever made. Well, it's a very good gun. I must say it is not Colt's finest double-action revolver. There were better guns, but I'll cover that another day. But I have to, this is my opinion, so there's not a right or wrong answer with this, but I will put the quality of the Smith & Wesson registered Magnum against the Python any day, and I'm a Colt guy, love Colts. Got many, many Colts. Love the Colt single action Army especially, but the registered Magnum is by far a finer gun than the Python ever dreamed of being. So just food for thought. That's my opinion. I may be wrong because your opinion may be different, but that's my opinion. But stand by because I will do a full view on the Python. It's a great gun, not trying to take anything away from it. Colt's made many very good double action guns, but this was not their finest gun. So just a teaser for another video, another day. But there you have it on the registered Magnum. Piece of history. an era gone by. It's unbelievable. The Smith & Wesson could bring out a gun that was significantly higher in price at $60 in the middle of the Great Depression, and they couldn't make them fast enough. They were just high demand. They only had a very small part of production set aside to make those guns, but it was a real boon to Smith & Wesson because, one, it made them more famous. Colt at that time dominated in sales, and Smith & Wesson hit with this gun, and man, it was just a beautifully well-made gun, incredibly smooth, wonderful guns. So there you have it, a piece of history. I enjoy my registered Magnums. They're not for sale. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time on the Pierce Brothers.